I'm here today with Tomas Sedlacek, who's an economist, works at a bank and lectures at a university, at Charles University in the Czech Republic. We're here in New Haven today for a consultation on theology of joy. Tomas, if I may, so glad to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. You know, as we jump into these conversations, we often find that we have to start right at the foundation, right at the basics, and kind of ask some of these kind of first questions. So let's start there. As far as you can tell, what is joy? What is it?
Well, you know, we economists work with the term utility, which is very close to sort of, you know, happiness or joy, and that's what we are teaching our students for reasons that one doesn't need to go into right now, that the purpose of existence is in fact increasing utility or increasing happiness or satisfaction or joy. Now, joy seems to me, of course, it depends how one defines the word, but it seems to be a temporary experience. It's not a state. I think it's impossible to have a prolonged state of joy, both in the terms of state meaning a period or a situation, and state meaning a country of joy. And we have examples of this, because I, as an economist, there's this, you know, crisis, and there's a lot of debate on how much is enough. So what I do as an economist, I look into the most joyful fantasies that mankind has ever had. And one of those is, of course, in religion or in theology, is the Garden of Eden, or then, of course, paradise later on in the future. We seem to be stuck between these two joyful states. To ask myself a question, can a person be happy in a context that is offering this happiness or joyfulness? I think I sometimes confuse the terms happiness and joyfulness. Happiness, I think you can have a happy life, can't have a joyful life sort of all the time.
And so you, in your paper that you prepared for the consultation for today, you actually talk about Eden, and you point out a couple of imperfections. Like to talk about those? And
yeah. Because normally we have this tradition that we don't mix economy with theology, but I, of course, being an economist, when I read the story of Genesis or creation, I do read it, and I see that there must have been an economic point, or what we today would consider an economic point. The original sin, during the medieval period, it usually was represented or understood to be of sexual nature for reasons unknown. In the story of Genesis, we only hear the sex mentioned once in the positive term, go and multiply. So the word sex doesn't really appear in the story of Genesis, but the word consume repeats 20 over times. Do not consume the fruit, and they consumed the fruit, and it was good for consumption, da-di-da-di-da-di-da. Which, of course, in my understanding, to have the same word repeated 20 times over 1 or 2 pages is bad literature, unless you have a point. So as an economist, I read the original sin as a sin of consumption or a sin of overconsumption, because clearly they didn't eat because they were hungry. They ate out of a motive that we don't know. But what's most important is that in classical theology, or in the understanding I think that mankind or Christian part of the world has, is that everything was perfect until Adam and Eve consumed the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then trouble started. And there's actually 2 instances that you could see, even in the Garden of Perfection. Now, this was something that God, the most perfect being that we know or have fantasized about, has created for these 2, or 1 and then 2 human beings that are also perfect. No illnesses, no psychological Oedipus complexes yet to run in your brain. And economically speaking, there was a garden of plenty. They had enough of work, etc., etc. And psychologically or theologically speaking, Adam had a direct access to God. They talked, and it was supposed to be a happy relationship. But we read that in this perfection, in the garden of joy, let's say, having a direct access to God, Adam felt alone. So this Christian cliche that, God is alone, God's the answer to everything, all you need is God, seems not to be true, because Adam wasn't happy. He felt alone. And if I created or you created me, or we had each other for a relationship, or with your partner, and that other partner feels alone in that relationship, it's not a good relationship. So there was some sort of a glitch already there before the fall. Adam felt alone. He could not find a companion. And then God creates, so the feeling is loneliness. Adam feels lonely, alone. And the reaction of God is he creates him a helper. Suitable helper, but nevertheless a helper, which is a little bit weird. You're alone and you get a helper. But never mind, there could have been something else going on. But what seems to be the second sort of imperfection in creation, even before the fall, is that the question that ultimately you have to ask: what was the second person, Eve in this case, what was she supposed to help Adam with? In other words, Adam was in his perfect state before sin. He was inadequate for whatever the job was. So his first feeling wasn't that of unemployment, but that of overemployment. He couldn't satisfy the task that he was supposed to do. Maybe he didn't even know the task that he was supposed to do, but he already got a helper. So that must have been also somewhat castrating feeling, that you are created to perform a certain task, but you are fundamentally unable to do that.
So in the Garden of Eden, we have consumption and we have labor, which makes it seem perfectly reasonable that an economist should be telling us about what's going on there. And interesting, and even in that perfect state, right? There are these imperfections. One of the things that we're always wanting to talk about in this project is we want to know about joy and we want to cultivate it. You seem to be skeptical, on my read of your work, that this cultivation is ever going to be successful.
Looking into the Old and New Testament, I am skeptical. It seems to me that, well, we don't know how long Adam and Eve were in this perfect state, but there was no history. There was nothing. Adam named the animals, and that's it. We don't hear of Adam being joyful. Nor do we read of Eve being joyful. On the contrary, there must have been something that they've been missing. Otherwise, they would never tasted the fruit. Also mark that God never said that the creation was perfect. He always says that it's good, very good, but not perfect. It was perhaps the snake that was trying to improve it into some perfection. And in fact, this is another curiosity. God creates human beings to be like him in his image. But when they know the knowledge of good and evil, God says they are too much like us. So there is a little bit of some dialectics going on here as well. But you can even see that perhaps the curse that Adam and Eve receive is of economic nature, because in economics everything is also a cross. We call it the Marshallian cross of demand and supply. And it is as if the curse that Adam and Eve receive is like this: because everything that I gave you wasn't good enough. In other words, when it's something better, nothing ever will be good enough. And Eve gets the curse of demand, so to speak. So now I'm paraphrasing. You will demand, you will desire, but your desires will not be in you. There will be somewhere else. You will not be in control of your own desires. Your desires, in fact, will be in control of you, and they will be disjointed somehow. It's very complicated dynamics between my own desires and myself. Some of my desires I desire to desire, other desires I don't desire to desire. So there seems to be some double derivation going on. So Eve gets this curse of demand, and Adam gets the curse of supply, the curse of labor. You will labor in the sweat of your brow. You will labor, and even with the technology of the 21st century, cell phones, internet, and mobile computing, it will not be enough. All you produce will not be, all you supplies will not be enough to satisfy the desire that you have gotten yourself into. And we see this curse being very active till today, even though we are 100 times richer than the society in the time that Bible was written. We suffer from the same curses.
In fact, more than that, you say that we've actually structured our entire economy around this insatiable desire.
Yeah.
You say at one point, if we've chosen discontent to be the engine of our progress, then fine. but we should not then complain that we are not content.
Yes.
And so there's something, discontent is kind of built into the system itself. We've, in a sense, well, you suggested here that we've chosen it. Is it a choice? Could we choose otherwise? Or is this fundamental to what it is to be a human?
So there's been always, so this seems to be fundamental to how human beings are naturally, so to speak. So you can read this in sort of the biblical tradition. You can also read it in other creating myths that human beings were discontent with the state of the world, and they started to change it, which is okay, but you only change things when you're discontent with them. And the problem is, and there's been many, of course, moral schools, notably, for example, the Greeks, the Stoa, debating with the utilitarians. I think there was a fundamental agreement that the human position or the human situation is, I desire this and I have this. So what the hedonists would suggest is, well, then, have more and more and more until you have as much as you desire, and then you'll be a content person. While the Stoa suggested the opposite, they said, well, if you have this and you desire this, then obviously you can live with this because you are alive, desiring the superflows. So decrease your desires and you will be a happy person. Now, we seem to have, in the last thousands of years of our Western civilization, followed the hedonist tradition. In other words, GDP growth until it grows so that everybody has everything that he or she wants. The problem with this school, though, however, is a non-trivial one. Desires do not get, let's say, the home run of desire is not to be satisfied, but multiplied. So you desire a car, you purchase that car, only to be able to desire slightly better cars. And we know this feeling, you're happy with that car for, I don't know what, two weeks. And now you can look up your window and say, oh, that's even a better car. I wish my cell phone batteries lasted 30% longer, et cetera, et cetera. So it is even a part of the classical economic rhetorics is that desires don't want to be fulfilled, but multiplied. We want newer and better desires. We actually want to have this tension, which is very productive. It wakes you up in the morning. It makes you put on a nice little cologne and a tie if one is so inclined. But it's an artificially kept, how should I say, gap, which we shouldn't complain that it's there because we sort of used it as an engine.
So is there another choice? Is there a way to have an economic engine driven, like a stoic, is there a way to pursue the kind of stoic ideal and still have progress or have a functional economy, or no?
That, I think, is in sort of a trade-off position to each other. You can either have content and you can be content, and then you're not so manic to change things and work better and harder, like the boxer character in George Orwell's Animal Farm. But you're right, it seems to be from this story in the Bible and other stories about Pandora in the Greek tradition and also in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that this discontent with the state of things is one of the oldest characteristics and also demons or challenges or temptations of mankind that we must somehow be able to cope with. There is this fear of progress. There's a love and hate relationship towards progress. You can see this still today with technology. We love it, we hate it. It's supposed to slave for us, but sometimes we feel we are slaving for it. It's also the whole body of economics sort of has this love and hate double emotion. We love to consume, but we also hate to consume. So these two sort of love and hate, as we know from personal relationships, are sometimes very close. It's also true of the systemic things that we do. So to sum it up, it's one of the oldest demons, if you will, of mankind, to which I think to curb them would be almost as difficult as these 2,000 years of GDP growth. If we'd been sort of trying to exercise moderation for 2,000 years, we would not be this rich, but we would be content. But this one can only speculate. It's not an easy issue to be happy with what you have.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Well, I mean, Augustine talks about kind of desire, that human beings are fundamentally driven by kind of desire that knows no limits.
Yes.
But Augustine says ultimately this shows that we are restless until our hearts find rest in God.
Yes.
Do you have hope for that sort of transcendent satisfaction, or at least that kind of transcendent orientation, providing some sort of solace while we're running this rat race?
I think we're running a rat race even in spiritual issues. I think this was, as much as I like Augustine, I would, I don't think our hearts will be, when we are finally dead, we would have to. I don't know how he meant it. My heart will be. My heart is restless until it rests in you. I think this is the quote. Yeah. So I don't know whether he meant rests in you as in today, 5th of September 2014, or rests when it stops beating. So when it's dead, it will probably be as happy as a stone. But that's not the happiness that we want. First point. Second point. I've never met a spiritual person who would say I'm spiritual enough, to put it quite bluntly. So the same sort of residuum of discontent that we have in material things, we seem to also have in spiritual things. And the more spiritual you are, the more unperfect, or the less perfect you feel. My second point, you can read this in Paul, you can even Saint Teresa, or whoever you would ask, are you now spiritually grown enough? Are you content with your spirituality? They would all say no. So there is a similar addiction dynamic like with consumption. The more spiritual you are, the more you feel your spiritual lack, etc. And my third point is all the stories in the Bible. Now let's go to the New Testament, if I may. So this is my interpretation. The story of a prodigal son, I read it as a sort of continuation or elaboration of the Eden story. There were two sons in sort of a haven, like in New Haven. They were not in heaven, but they were in haven, and the father was there, so they also had a perfect relationship with the father. And one of the sons decides to go away into the world, and then there is this very strange sentence in the Bible, in this parable, when the prodigal son is already really down, eating or not even being allowed to eat what the pigs eat. We read that he came to himself, which to me is a very strange formulation, because who comes to who? What's the distance between self and self? Is there a good self and a bad self? So how could myself miss myself? So he was not himself. In other words, we also use this quite regularly in common language. I think we human beings are not ourselves. This is when it comes to one of the ways how to interpret the name of God, I am who I am. Then we human beings are those who are not what we are. We have a psychological structure in consumption and also in spiritual and in everywhere, not being what we wish to be or what we want to be. Our desires are mismatched. We can't control them. Anyway, so this prodigal son then returns back to his father. Also marked that his turning point was of economic nature. He didn't decide to return to the father because he somehow had an epiphany, but he literally had nothing to eat. He was dying, he was starving, he was in economic lack. That's what made spiritual repentance, to put it. And then he comes back to his father. Also mark, now that we're talking about progress, that the most sums up, the most favored, the most preferred direction in the Bible is back, which is interesting. Not forward, but come back, return. And that is what it seems that God wants from us reading the Bible is a return, not a progress. That's also a footnote that I think could have some interesting dynamics when employed to it. But nevertheless, now he then comes back. So the question is whether the other son, let's call him the older son, it seems that he's sort of older, who stayed with the father, who didn't leave to the world, who actually stayed in the paradise. So let's imagine that maybe this is a description of a situation of what would happen if Adam and Eve actually wouldn't partake of the fruit. Then we must ask ourselves whether this son was happy, the older son, whether he was content, and most importantly, whether he was himself. And I can only answer that he wasn't himself. He couldn't rejoice, now that we're coming back to the topic of joy. Not only was he not happy that his own brother came back alive, he was angry. He couldn't be happy for himself. He couldn't be happy for his brother. To a degree, understandable. What's completely ununderstandable, I can't understand, is that he couldn't even rejoice, not in his joy, but in the joy of his father. So he storms out at the father and is quite angry with him. And then from the context, we read that he never was joyful. He never really enjoyed that garden. So it seems, from reading the Bible or just listening to my friends and reading the newspapers, that we human beings could be defined like creatures that will do anything they can to get into their paradise. In other words, to have this sort of desire component removed or happy, to be in harmony. But the moment we get there, 5 minutes, maybe 7, we will do anything that we can to get out of the paradise, even the most ridiculous exercises such as touching the very one tree that we were not supposed to touch. And there are other stories in the Bible that you can relate to this. And also, the story of Lilith. She left the garden of paradise because she felt that the sexual position of lying under Adam, Lilith was, according to a Hebrew myth, the first woman created before Eve. She had to lie under Adam, and that to her was unbearably humiliating for reasons unknown. Today it doesn't seem to be a problem of any nature. That she would actually leave the paradise and get cursed by a terrible curse of having to give birth to 100 children a day and eat the very same 100 children a day. She said, I'd rather choose that than to stay in the paradise. So I think this dynamics of eternal return and eternal departure from our bliss points is quite characteristics of our Western civilization.
I was just speaking to Bob Emmons a few minutes ago, and he does a lot of work in gratitude. And it would seem like, in a certain sense, this is what gratitude is at least designed to do, is to save us from this sort of cycle, right?
Yes.
And actually, gratitude is, in a certain sense, invoked in the prodigal son story. The father says to the older son, "Didn't you know everything I have, all that is mine, is yours?"
Yes.
Including, interestingly enough, as you said, my joy. Why can't you share in my joy? But there's a call there to say, be grateful. Actually, receive creation, receive what I've provided, and be grateful for it. Now that may be very difficult to execute, but do you see in gratitude the kind of seeds of a kind of a different sort of posture?
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really discontent. To be grateful is to be full of great. In beautiful language that we call English. So you can be great if you are actually able to see that, and gratefulness is something that goes fundamentally against discontent. And this system under which we live today cannot handle gratefulness. If we cease to be discontent, the system would stop to grow, which in my view would be fine. But this sort of imperative of economic growth would be paralyzed or crippled. So absolutely, gratefulness as this is how I read the Shabbat commandment, which is in today's world we've turned that from a commandment to a suggestion. If only we treated all commandments like we've treated Shabbat commandment, it's don't kill, of course, unless he's a real idiot. So then you can kill him, but do it quickly and humanely. Don't torture him for too long, or don't commit adultery. But if she or he is attractive, then do it. So this is how we've treated Shabbat commandment. Don't work on Saturday, but pick a day, or if you have something important to do, it's okay. But the meaning of Shabbat was exactly for 6 days. Well, of course, an interpretation for 6 days. Change the world, be unhappy with it, but one day, be happy with the world. Don't change. Just enjoy like God enjoyed the garden of his creation. God didn't rest because he had another multiverse to create the next day. And he rested like we rest today. We rest. Today, rest has become a subset of working more efficiently and harder.
Yeah. It's useful because it serves our ability to work more.
Exactly.
Right.
So it was. I always thought work is a subset of rest. I work in order to rest, but today we rest in order to work. These subject-object reversals you can see, materializing all the way. So the Shabbat commandment, it's the fourth commandment, which is the first of the sort of say the practical commandments, and is also the longest commandment, by the way. And it's the only commandment where there's actually given reason why we should rest on Saturdays. Don't kill. There's no reason why we shouldn't kill. I mean, the Ten Commandments don't give a reason why not. Only when it comes to the fourth commandment, it actually gives a reason why we shouldn't work on Saturday. And ironically enough, to sort of bring it back to the real economy, one way how to read the crisis is that it's an enforced Shabbat from the outside. The technology is tired. Environment is tired. We worked it too hard and too greedily. Human beings are tired. Now a quote comes to me from Lord of the Rings, from Tolkien, when the dwarves have dug too deep and too greedily, what have they awoken in the dog? So it seems like us, only we don't dig down, we dig up. And then we awake demons that are there and should never been disturbed.
Quite the opposite of the rest into which we're invited, we're commanded to enter into, and the joy, presumably, that we might find there if we could reach that place of rest and of gratitude and satisfaction.
Yeah, which doesn't mean passivity. This is something that a very famous medieval mystic, sort of Christian author, Mr. Eckhart, was contemplating about. He said, is it a contemplative world in which I can be grateful and sort of not move, or the active world in which I'm buzzing around? And then he finally, quite ingeniously, in the medieval times already, discovered that there is no conflict between the two. Being grateful and sort of appreciated does not mean that you're idle. On the contrary, God is also very active, but he can sort of rest in that activity. So you're not dictated by external things to work, but you are sort of playing in the garden, so to speak. So when I work, I play in the garden.
Tomas, I look forward to our conversations later
Absolutely.
today. Thank you so much.
Me too. It's been a great pleasure. It's been a great 15 minutes of joy for me.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for giving that to me.